Last time I talked about switching out my gravel bike handlebars for flat bars, covering all the reasons I made that change. If you have not seen that video, press pause and go and watch that first. Because now, after some real world testing, it's time to revisit that choice. How has the gravel bike with flat bars instead of drop bars been? In this video, I'm diving into what it's been like and answering the big question. Was this swap actually worth it, or was it just a big mistake? Do flat bars actually belong on a gravel bike? First off, let's talk about a common mistake I see when people switch to flat bars on their gravel bikes. They often end up going for bars that are just way too wide. This can lead to a lot of people questioning the point of a gravel bike with flat bars in the first place. And honestly, I'd agree with that criticism. If you are using a wide flat bar or riser bar, it's a bit like setting yourself up for wind resistance on every ride. And why not just get a mountain bike at that point? But with a narrow flat bar, things start to shift in a more practical direction, I think. Most people assume that the advantage of a drop bar is, well, the drop. But that's not actually where you spend most of your time. It's mostly up on the hoods, with the drops themselves only being used very occasionally on long descents. What really makes drop bars effective is actually the narrow width, which allows you to ride in a more aerodynamic position, slicing through that pesky wind for less drag. Wide flat bars, on the other hand, put you in an upright position, a bit like a sail catching the wind, which completely loses that aerodynamic edge. Sure, wider flat bars are great for control, especially on rough terrain. But when you're bikepacking and pedaling over long distances, the extra control can sometimes feel a bit excessive or unnecessary, depending on the route, of course. So when I made the switch to flat bars, I didn't want to sacrifice that streamlined position. I still wanted to keep this bike a gravel bike. I chose a narrow 600mm flat bar, only slightly wider than the position I would have been if I was riding on the hoods on my old drop bars, and exactly the same width as the flared ends on the drops. This means my position has barely changed at all. It's maybe a little different, but not in a way that significantly affects wind resistance, which helps keep this bike fast rolling and preserves that gravel bike feel. And I made this choice intentionally. While my position remains almost identical to before, there is still the big advantage with flat bars. They offer noticeably more control when you're riding on rougher trails, like a lot of what we have here in the UK. And let's face it, here in the UK, we don't have loads of smooth, perfect gravel trails. Most of what I ride are rocky bridleways, muddy tracks, and uneven paths. These are way more off-road adventure than gravel riding. Having flat bars puts your arms and hands in a position where they can absorb more of the impact from them uneven surfaces. Most trails here are more rugged than actual gravel, so switching to a narrow flat bar has generally helped me with control on them rougher trails. This change has given me that extra control boost while preserving the bike's speed and aerodynamics. It still feels like a gravel bike. The narrow flat bar has kept me in a fairly gravel bike position, just with a better stance to handle them rougher trails. It gives me more control on them uneven paths without feeling like I'm steering an actual mountain bike. It's a balance that is working really well for UK trails. In fact, the change to flat bars completely shifted how I see and think about using this bike. When I attempted the Highland Trail 550, granted I didn't actually finish it, I had originally planned to use my mountain bike. But because at the time it was broken, I ended up using this now flat bar gravel bike, and I can honestly say the only reason I even considered taking on a ride like the Highland Trail 550 with the gravel bike was because it actually had flat bars. If it still had drop bars, I would not have even considered it, and I probably would have just postponed that ride. But because I really didn't want to postpone it, I looked at the gravel bike. I said, well, it's not got drop bars on it now. I think it would manage the Highland Trail 550. And while the bike did, I did not. In my previous video, I mentioned that I had gotten rid of the drop bars. A lot of comments were saying I should add bar ends for the added hand positions. I had actually originally planned on doing this, but after riding the bike for a little while, I've actually decided not to bother, and I'm not going to add them. I've got a lot of experience riding very long days in the saddle with multiple days of over 250 miles, and with those kinds of rides I've always kind of got into the habit of moving my hands around the bars anyway, so I haven't really found any need for any bar ends or anything more, because I am able to get all the different positions just on a normal flat bar. I found I can ride the whole day without any discomfort. I've got to say, another big win for the flat bars on the gravel bike is just how much easier they are to maintain compared to the drop bar setups. With flat bars, your brakes and gear shifters are separate components. This makes everything just simpler. If one thing breaks, you only need to fix or replace that specific part. On drop bar setups though, the shifters and brakes are integrated, so when something goes wrong, it can get expensive and often means more work to just get it fixed. For me, this simplicity isn't just nice to have, it's essential. Since I rely on my bike for my work on YouTube, I can't afford to have it out of action for long. The less time I spend faffing around with repairs, the more time I can actually spend riding, filming, and then eventually editing. Flat bars make that much easier. If a shifter breaks, I swap it out. If I need to tweak the brakes, I can do that without having to deal with the whole integrated system. It's all straightforward. And that's exactly what I personally need from a bike. I need it to be reliable. There's also the cost side of things. Flat bar components are generally cheaper, whether new or even secondhand. And because everything is separate, you don't have to fork out for a whole new integrated shifter or brake unit when one bit breaks. It's a setup that's not only easier to maintain, but also lighter on the wallet when things eventually break or need replacing, which for me feels like a never-ending cycle. So, after all that, was it a mistake to switch to flat bars on my gravel bike? Honestly, for my use, bikepacking and riding rough UK trails, I'd say no. It was definitely worth it, but I can see how it might not be the best option for everyone. If you're someone who uses their bike for a lot of different things, like commuting or just out on a day ride, drop bars might still have the edge. They are more comfortable for long distance, and they are great if you need to tuck down into an aerodynamic position for efficiency. They are also just a lot of fun. One thing flat bars do offer though is more space for things like a bar bag, which is a real bonus for bike packing. That extra space for a flat bar gravel bike gives you more room to load up and stay organised on them longer trips. But for a day-to-day ride or commute where you don't need a massive bag, drop bars might be a better fit for a sleeker setup. So while flat bars work perfectly for the kind of rough terrain and long haul bikepacking I do, if you are using your bike for other purposes like a bit of road riding or mixed use setup, you might want to think about how you're using your bike. It's not a one size fits all answer, but for me, flat bars on my gravel bike have worked out really, really well. However, I do believe it's because I kept them narrow.
Just don't pass on the dare. If you have the will and a moment to spare, it's a beautiful world out there. It's a beautiful world out there. It can be a bit frightening. It's something you